They call this place secure? We'll see about that.
Grapple locked and loaded. Ready, steady, go!
Introducing your champion.
I honor those who've risen, not those who've fallen.
We should land there.
Crystals
Looks like
reveal
fun.
their hidden structures when broken.
Heard that.
I love this part! Ha!
this place secure. We'll see about that.
pages a whole lot more interactive. JavaScript is going to give us the ability, tags now, I can write JavaScript code that is going to be written in JavaScript that will run inside of the web browser JavaScript function, for example. So let's go ahead and give that a try. I'll go ahead and now, instead of just saying alert hello world, Okay, welcome back everyone to web programming with Python and JavaScript. And today we turn our attention to the second of the main programming languages that we'll be looking at in this class, in particular JavaScript. And to get an understanding for why it is that JavaScript is actually helpful, let's go back and revisit this diagram of what communication over the internet will generally look like. Oftentimes we'll have a user, otherwise known as the client, using their computer on their web browser, whether that's Chrome or Safari or some other web browser, that sends an HTTP request, a web request, to some sort of web server. That server then processes that request and then returns some sort of response that comes back to the client. Thus far, all of the code that we've written, the Python web application code running in a Django web application, for example, has all been code that runs on some sort of server. Code that is listening for requests, doing some computation in order to process that request, and then generating some sort of response, usually in the form of an HTML template that we then send back to the client. What JavaScript is going to enable us to do is to begin to write client-side code. JavaScript is going to allow us to write code that actually runs inside of the user's web browser on the client. And this can be useful for a number of reasons. One, if there's computation that we want to do, but we don't need to go out and reach out to a server in order to do so, we can do the computation potentially faster just by running the code exclusively on the client. And in addition to that, we can begin to make our web pages a whole lot more interactive. JavaScript is going to give us the ability to directly manipulate the DOM, where again, the DOM is the document object model, that tree-like hierarchy that represents the web page.
It's just bloody whinge with you, isn't it?
JavaScript will enable us to write code that directly manipulates the content on the web page, and we'll see how that can be quite powerful very soon. So how do we then use JavaScript inside of a web page in order to add some code, add some programming logic to a web page? Well, so far we've already seen HTML, the language we use to describe the structure of a web page, where an HTML page just describes the structure of a page in terms of nested tags. We have those head tags at the top of the page, the body tags that describe the structure of the page, and then additional tags that can be nested within those. And in order to add JavaScript to a web page, it's as simple as including some script tags that are often located inside of the HTML page itself. When we use these script tags, we're telling the browser that anything in between these script tags should be interpreted, in this case, as JavaScript code in the web browser. So our very first program, for example, might just look like a line of code inside of the script tag, something like this, where alert, for example, you produce an alert, and then just as the functions in Python, the functions in JavaScript can take arguments. So in between these parentheses, we have an argument, something like the string hello world, the text that we would like to display to the user. So let's go ahead and give this a try and see how we can actually use this code to write JavaScript that is going to run inside of the user's web browser. I'll go ahead and create a new file that we'll call hello.html. And inside of it, I'll include the same basic HTML structure that we've already seen before, where I have a head section that has a title, and then a body that maybe just says hello, for example. And so now what I'd like to do is add a little bit of JavaScript to this web page. So in the head section of my web page, I'm going to go ahead and add a script tag, where in between these script tags now, I can write JavaScript code that is going to be written in JavaScript that will run inside of the web browser when the user actually opens up this page. And for now, I'll just say alert, and then hello world. It turns out in JavaScript, you can use either single quotation marks or double quotation marks in order to represent strings. I'll generally use single quotation marks here just by convention. So here I'm running a function called alert that's going to display an alert, something like hello world to the user. And that's going to be inside of the script tags of this HTML page. So now, if I want to actually open the page up, I can open hello.html, or you could just visit it inside of your web browser, whether it's Chrome or something else. And now at the top of the page, what you'll notice is that I get a little bit of an alert, some interaction where it says this page says hello world, and it gives me an option to like press a button, for example, like hello, or like the OK button that'll say, all right, dismiss the alert now. And this is our very first example of JavaScript. We have a function called alert built into JavaScript for our web browser, and our web browser knows that when we call the alert function, the browser should display an alert message that looks a little something like that. And if I click the OK button to dismiss the alert, then we go ahead and get back the original page that I had from the beginning. And so now we can begin to imagine that using this ability to programmatically display alerts, that we can add additional features to our applications as well. And one big area where JavaScript can be quite powerful is with event-driven programming. And what event-driven programming is all about is thinking about things that happen on the web in terms of events that happen. What are some examples of events? Events are things like the user clicks on a button, or the user selects something from a drop-down list, or the user scrolls through a list or submits a form. Anything the user does can generally be thought of as an event. And what we can do with JavaScript is add event listeners or event handlers, things that say, when an event happens, go ahead and run this particular block of code, or this function, for example. And using that, we can begin to allow our JavaScript code to respond to how the user is actually interacting with our web page, to say, when the user clicks on a button, I would like to run this particular JavaScript function, for example. So let's go ahead and give that a try. I'll go ahead and now, instead of just saying alert hello world, let me put this alert inside of a function. And to create a function in JavaScript, you just use the keyword function, followed by the name of the function. I'll call the function hello, for example. And then in parentheses, any inputs that function takes. This hello function is not going to take any input, so I'll just use an empty set of parentheses. And then inside of curly braces, I include any of the code that I want to run in this function. And so what I've done here now is create a function called hello. And then inside of the curly braces, I've defined the body of the function, what code should run when I run the hello function. And what the hello function should do is it should display an alert that in this case says hello world. So now what I'd like to do is get this function to run when something happens on the page. For example, when a user clicks on a button. So to do that, the first thing I'll need to do is actually create a button. So I'll add a button that just says, like, click here, for example. So now if I refresh this page, I now see that I have hello, and I also have this button that says click here. But when I click here, like, nothing happens. I'm clicking the click here button, but it's not changing anything, because I haven't yet said what should happen when the user does click on this button. And so one way we could do this is by adding an attribute to this HTML element called onClick. What this is going to do is it's going to add an onClick handler to this button. It's going to say what should happen when the user clicks on this button. And I'm going to set the onClick attribute equal to running the function hello. And in order to run a function in JavaScript, just as you ran a function with Python, you use the name of the function followed by a set of parentheses to say, go ahead and actually run this function. Using those parentheses calls the function, another word for running the function. And the fact that there's nothing in between the parentheses means we're not providing anything as input to the hello function. Though if the hello function did take inputs, we could certainly add that in between the parentheses. So now I've tied the two pieces of this page together. I have a button that says click here. And I've added an onClick handler that says that when you click on the button, you should run the hello function. And then up above, I've defined the hello function to say, what should the hello function do? Well, when the function is called, we're going to display an alert that in this case says hello world. So now we should be able to refresh the page. We still see the same thing, at least initially, where it just says hello and a button that tells me to click here. But now, if I go ahead and click the button that says click here, well, then I get the alert that says this page says hello world. I can press OK. And this event handler is always going to work. I click the button again, and I get the alert a second time. Because every time I click the button, it's going to call the hello function again. And when I click when the hello function runs, it is going to display this particular alert. So this now appears to give us a fair amount of power. And much as in other programming languages, languages like Python or other languages you might have worked with, JavaScript has all of these same types of language features. So far, we've seen data types, things like a string, but we also have other data types that we'll take a look at soon too. We've seen functions, some functions that are built into JavaScript, like the alert function, and other functions that we can write for ourselves, functions like hello. But we also have the ability to include things like variables inside of our program as well. So what might that look like? Well, I'll go ahead and create a new file. we'll call counter.html. And counter is going to have some of the similar code to hello, so I'll just go ahead and copy it for now, but I'll clear out the script section, change the title from hello to counter. And now, inside, I'll get rid of the button. Or actually, I'll keep the button. But instead of saying click here, the button is going to say count. I'd like to create a program that just counts for me, from 0 to 1 to 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. And now, in order to do that, in order to have some way of counting repeatedly, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm going to need to have some sort of variable inside of my program, something that is keeping track of data, like the number that I'm currently have counted to. So in order to do that in JavaScript, I can say something like let counter equal 0. This is the way in JavaScript that I define a new variable. I first say let counter, meaning let there be a new variable called counter, and I'm going to initially set the value of counter equal to the number 0. And now when I click on the button, instead of running the hello function, I'm going to go ahead and run the count function, which doesn't exist yet, but I'll now write it. I'll define a function called count. And what the count function is going to do is it is going to first increment the value of counter. And a number of ways I could do that. One is by saying counter equals counter plus 1, to say go ahead and reset the value of counter to whatever counter is plus 1. And there are a couple of shorthand notations for this. I could equivalently say counter plus equals 1, to say add 1 to the counter. Or in the case of adding 1, JavaScript, much like languages like C, if you've seen them before, support notation like this, counter plus plus, which just means take the value of counter and increment it, add 1 to it. So I'll add 1 to the value of counter. And then I'll just display an alert that has whatever the current value of counter happens to be. And so I've incremented the value of counter and then displayed an alert that shows me what's contained inside of counter. And so now, if I go ahead and not go to hello.html, but to counter.html instead, I now see that I still see a button that says count. And if I click on that button, I get an alert that this time says 1. We've incremented the value of counter from 0 to 1. The alert now says 1, and I can press OK. If I press count again, the count now goes to 2. I press OK, press count again, it goes to 3. And every time I click count, it is going to increment the value of the variable counter inside of my JavaScript web page. And then it's going to display an alert that is going to contain the value of that variable. So using alerts now, we're able to manipulate, we can inside of functions manipulate the values of variables and then display alerts that show the contents of those variables. But ultimately, when users are interacting with the page, it's going to be fairly annoying if the only way that we have to interact with the user is via displaying these alerts, the equivalent of like printing something out, except instead of printing it to a terminal, we're printing it via an alert that appears on the screen. What would be more interesting and more powerful, and much more useful in the context of a web page, is if we could programmatically update the website, change something about the web page the user is actually seeing, changing the content that happens to be on the page. And turns out JavaScript is going to enable us to do that as well, because JavaScript allows us to manipulate the DOM, the document object model, that represents all of the elements that happen to be on that page. So to do that, let's go ahead and return to hello.html. This again was this web page that just said hello and gave me a button where if I clicked on that button, it would display an alert that said hello world. Now what I'd like to do is instead of having the hello function display an alert, I'd like to have it manipulate something on the page. What I want it to manipulate? Well, inside the body of the page, I here have this heading that just says hello, for example, each one element. And what I might like to do is actually change that. How can I do that? Well, it turns out that in JavaScript, we have access to a function called document.querySelector. And what document.querySelector is going to do is it is going to give us the ability to look through the HTML page and extract an element out of that page, so that we can manipulate that HTML element using JavaScript code. And so if I want to select like an H1 element, I can say document.querySelector. And then as the argument, the input to document.querySelector, I'll go ahead and say H1, meaning go through the page, find me an H1 element. And querySelector is only going to return one element. So if there are multiple, it's going to return the first thing it finds. But here we only have one H1 element, so it's OK. I'm going to say look through this document, try and find an H1 element. And when you do, I'd like to manipulate it. And the way I'd like to manipulate it is by saying dot inner HTML equals, let's say, goodbye, for example. So all right, what's going on here? Well, right now, initially, when we first load the page, we have an h1, a big heading at the top that just says hello. And now when this hello function is called, which is called when this button is clicked on, because it has an onClick attribute that is equal to hello, calling the hello function, what the hello function is going to do is it's going to say document.querySelector h1. Find me the h1 element. That will return this element right here. JavaScript representation of this HTML element that is just an h1, whose HTML inside of it says hello. And if I want to change that HTML, I can do that by modifying the inner HTML property of the JavaScript element. In order to update a property of anything in JavaScript, we'll generally use this dot notation, where dot acts as a property of some particular object. And so I have this element, this h1, and saying dot inner HTML means take that element and access its inner HTML property, some property of that object. And I would like to update its inner HTML to just, in this case, be the word goodbye, followed by an exclamation, for example. So now what we'll see is that when we run this page, when we open this page up, as by opening up hello.html, I still see an h1 that says hello. I still see a button that says click here. But now, when I actually click on the button, click here, you'll see that hello changes to goodbye. We've run JavaScript code that finds an h1 element on the page and manipulates it, changing it to something else than it was originally. Now every time I click here, nothing else happens, because every time I click here, it's going to find the same h1, and it's going to update its HTML, changing it from hello to goodbye. So maybe what I'd really like then is the ability to toggle back and forth between hello and goodbye, rather than just change it from one thing to something else. Every time I click the button, I'd like it to alternate back and forth. And there are a number of ways you could imagine doing this, but one way is by taking advantage of conditions. So much in the same way that a language like Python has conditions, ifs and elifs and elses, JavaScript too has if and else that allow us to describe conditions such that we can only run certain blocks of code when a particular Boolean expression is true. So what would that look like? Well, let's go ahead and say, inside of this hello function, I can ask a question. If document.querySelector h1's inner HTML is equal to hello, we'll then go ahead and set it to goodbye. And else, then go ahead and update the inner HTML of this h1 element. Go ahead and set it to hello instead. So what is this hello function doing? It's now a little bit more sophisticated. It now has a condition where I say if, the keyword if, followed by in parentheses, the condition that I want to check for, the thing I want to see, is this true or not? And what I'm checking for is, let me run document.querySelector h1, which again looks through the page, finds me the h1 tag, and gets that element for me. If I look at that inner HTML, if it is equal to hello, then I want to do something. And this triple equal sign here is JavaScript's way of checking for strict equality, checking to make sure that two values are equal and also that their types are the same thing. That if this is a string, this must also be a string. It turns out in JavaScript there's also a weaker way to check for equality that just uses two equal signs, and that is going to check that values are the same, but it's going to allow for a bit of differences in type. The two things might have different types, but so long as they're basically the same value, the double equal sign might generally come to be true. Usually, if you can, you'll want to use this triple equal sign, this strict equality, to make sure that not only are the types the same, but the values are the same too, and the triple equal sign will check both of those things. So if I go ahead and find the h1 element, and its inner HTML is the word hello, we'll then go ahead and find the h1 element and update its inner HTML, setting it equal to goodbye, for example. And else, go ahead and find that same h1 element, update its inner HTML, set it equal to hello. And again, just as in functions, where we use these curly braces to enclose the body of the function, all of the lines of code that are inside of the function, JavaScript does the same thing too. That inside of a condition, when we want to express that this is inside the body of an if condition, I can use curly braces to say this line of code and that line of code, that's inside of the if expression, or that's inside of the else expression. So let's go ahead and try this. I can go ahead and open hello.html, refresh it, it currently says hello. The button says now, when I click here, hello changes to goodbye, and when I click here again, goodbye changes. Every time I click the button, it's going to alternate between hello and goodbye, because we either get caught in the if expression or we get caught in the else expression. Now, there are a couple of places where you might look at this and notice that maybe this isn't as efficient as this code could potentially be. And recall that every time we run document.querySelector, if they go ahead and try and find a particular HTML element for me, it's going to look through that page to try and find the element. And it turns out that right now, we have 3 separate calls to querySelector, even though only 2 of them will ever run on any we call document.querySelector, then we call it again. We can probably improve the design of this page by factoring that out, by just looking for the HTML element once, and then manipulating it and checking it using that element. So that we store an element inside of the variable. In the same way that a variable can store a number, like a counter, or a string, like hello world, it can also store other values, like an HTML element that we get back from document.querySelector. So I could say something like, let heading, where heading is just the name of a variable, be equal to document.querySelector h1, for instance. Find the h1 element, save it inside of a variable called heading. And now, rather than document.querySelector h1 all the time, I can just say, if the heading's inner HTML is hello, then set the heading's inner HTML to goodbye. Otherwise, set the heading's inner HTML to hello. So I've improved the efficiency of the program, but also reduced the number of characters of code that I've had to write. My lines are now much shorter, a little bit easier to read. This we would consider to be an improvement in design. And it turns out there's one other improvement we can make here too, that we can define a variable like let something equal something else. But it turns out that JavaScript gives us a couple of ways to define a variable. And if we're going to be creating a variable whose value is never going to change, we're never going to reassign the variable name to something else, then instead of let, we can enforce that it's never going to change by calling it a const variable. So const heading equals document.querySelector h1 means I am going to create a variable called heading, setting it equal to the result of document.querySelector h1, and never again will I change what heading is equal to. I will never have another line of code that says heading equals something else because it is constant. And JavaScript will then enforce that this variable should not change. And if ever I do try to change it, JavaScript will give me an error. And this can just be helpful to prevent against possible unintended behavior. That if you know you have a variable that is never going to change, it's often good design to label it as a const variable so that you and other people looking at your code know that that is never going to have a value that gets changed later on. So this then will behave the same way, where it says hello, but I can toggle it back and forth, changing it to goodbye, and then changing it back to hello again. And so now using this ability to manipulate the DOM, we can go back to our counter program and actually improve upon it. That right now, the counter program, I count and it displays an alert that says 1. I count and it displays an alert that says 2. I can probably do a little bit better than that by, instead of displaying an alert, actually manipulating the DOM in some way. That I would like to have this h1, this big heading at the top, instead of starting out by saying hello, let's have it start out by saying 0, for example, just some initial value for the counter. And now when I increment the value of counter, rather than display an alert that just tells me the value of the counter in an alert, I'm going to instead say document.querySelector h1 dot inner HTML equals counter, where I'm saying find the h1 element, update its inner HTML, set it equal to whatever the value of the variable counter happens to be, such that now if I refresh this page, the value of this h1 initially is 0. That's the initial value. But every time I click count, we're going to update the contents of that h1 element, this time setting it to 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Every time I click the count button, it's going to increment the value of the variable as well as manipulate the DOM, actually making changes in order to produce the effect that I want to see on this actual page. And we can begin to add additional logic to this as well. Maybe I do occasionally want an alert, but I don't want an alert every single time. I could add a condition. I could say something like, if I only want to display an alert every time I count to a multiple of 10, like 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 and so forth, I could add a condition that says that if counter mod 10, and mod just gets me remainder when you divide by 10. So if you take the counter, divide it by 10. If the remainder is 0 when I divide by 10, well, that means counter is a multiple of 10. And so I can now display an alert where I can display an alert that says, like, I want to say something like, the counter is now 10, or the counter is now 20. And in order to do that, what I really want to do is have some way of plugging in a variable into a string inside of JavaScript. And in Python, the way we would have done this is by appending f, or prepending f in front of the string to create a formatted string. And then I would have said something like the count is now, and then I'd use curly braces to say, go ahead and print out the value of counter. So this f for formatted string followed by this string would have been the way in Python that we would have done this. Turns out JavaScript does the same thing, just with slightly different syntax. It doesn't use f. Instead of using the regular quotation marks, whether the single or double quotation marks, JavaScript uses these backticks, which are usually located above the tab key on a standard US keyboard. And this is going to create what JavaScript calls a template literal, where I can then substitute the value of a variable somewhere inside of this template. And then in order to actually do the substitution, while Python uses double curly braces to say plug in the value of something right here, JavaScript does something similar. It also uses double curly braces, but there needs to be a dollar sign. Dollar sign and then the double curly braces, you can go ahead and plug in the value of the variable there. So this then is a template literal, where every time we get to a multiple of 10, we're going to display an alert that says the count is now, and then this dollar sign curly brace means actually plug in whatever the value of counter happens to be right there. So now if I go ahead and refresh counter, it starts at 0. I can count 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but when I get to 10, then I get an alert that says the count is now 10. So that template literal will allow us to combine variables and strings in order to generate new strings that are able to represent data inside of them as well. So now what improvements can we begin to make here? What changes can we make to this to improve upon the design of it? Well, one thing, especially as our programs get a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more complicated, is that we often don't want to be intermingling our JavaScript code with the contents of our HTML. That down here, we have button on-click equals count, this is the name of this function. And especially as our page starts to get more complicated, it's going to start to get a little bit annoying if we're constantly having to maintain a little bit of JavaScript code, like making a call to a function, inside of our HTML. We'll see a little bit later, there are other paradigms that actually encourage this type of thing. But right now, it can start to get a little poorly designed. We really like to separate all of our JavaScript-related code from all of the HTML. So there are ways we can begin to do that as well. I can add an event location inside of JavaScript that I can say something like document.querySelector button. And then I can say .onClick equals count. So what's going on here? And I can do this instead of this onClick equals count. What I'm now saying is document.querySelector button. Find me the button on the page. It turns out there's only one button here, so it's fine. So if there were more, I might have to be a little bit more specific. But once I get that button, then I'm going to access this onClick property, and I'm going to set it equal to count. And what is count? Count is the name of a function. Count is itself a function, and so what I'm here saying is I would like to set the value of the onClick property of the button equal to count. The count is the function that should run when the button is clicked on. And notice that I am not actually calling the function. It's not count and then parentheses, which would mean run the count function and then get its return value and use that as the value for onClick. I'm just setting onClick equal literally to the count function itself without actually calling the function. And what this is going to do, it is going to say when the button is clicked on, then and only then should you actually run this count function. And we're not going to run the count function until that button actually gets clicked on. And so in JavaScript, functions can be treated as values of their own. Just as you can set a variable equal to a string, just as you can set a variable equal to an integer, just as you can set a variable equal to like an HTML element, like the result of document.querySelector, you can also set a variable equal to a function. something like count, and pass that around as a value just as you could with any other value. And this is a paradigm we generally call functional programming, where we have functions as values of their own, things that we can reassign, things that we can manipulate just as we could any other value. So now I can try and run this program by going ahead and refresh the page. I'll refresh it, it's 0, I press count, and all right, nothing seems to be happening. It's still 0. I want it to be counting, but it doesn't seem to be working. So why not? Anytime you run into problems in JavaScript where you're not getting the behavior you want, often it can be helpful to look at the JavaScript console, where the JavaScript console is the equivalent of like the terminal window when you're running your Django application in Python that would display any error messages. The JavaScript console will display any of the JavaScript logging information and error messages as well. In Chrome, I can get to it if I first go ahead and go to Inspect, and then just open up the console tab here. And all right, we seem to have some sort of error here. It's an uncaught type error that says we cannot set property onClick of null in counter.html line 18. So that will generally tell you where the error is coming from. It's coming from counter.html on line 18. And the problem seems to be that I'm trying to access the onClick property of null. And null is JavaScript's way of expressing like nothing, some object that doesn't exist. So somehow I'm trying to set the onClick property of null. Well, let's see what's going on line 18 and see if we can figure out what's happening there. Well, all right, here's line 18, where I say document.querySelectorButton, setting its onClick property equal to count. And now what seems to be the problem here? Well, the error message was that I was trying to modify the onClick property of null. Well, here then is the onClick property. So why would this document.querySelectorButton be returning or giving me an output null? Well, it turns out the document.querySelector will return null if it's not able to find something. If I try and find a button, but it's not able to find a button. Well, this seems a little bit strange because there's a button down here on line 24 that I'd like for my JavaScript code to be able to find when it runs querySelector and tries to find the button. As it turns out, this is a bit of the quirk of the way the browser is going to work, but if the browser is running our code from top to bottom, reading it from line 1 on and on, then it's going to get to line 18, where I've said document.querySelectorButton.onClick will count, and it's going to try and find a button on line 18, but the button doesn't show up on my HTML page until much further down. So at this point, to get to this line of JavaScript, JavaScript is looking for the button, but the DOM, the body of the page, hasn't finished loading. The content of the DOM has not yet loaded, and as a result, we're not able to find this button. So how do we solve this problem? How do we get it so we actually are able to like ask for the button and actually get the button? Well, it turns out there are a couple of strategies we could use. One would be take the script tag and go ahead and just move it to the bottom section of the body, so that after we've already defined the button count, then we have the script tag and then go ahead and now find the button, and now we'll be able to find it. Turns out another way, and perhaps a more common way, is to instead add yet another event listener. And we're going to add an event listener not to the button, but to the entire document, where document is a variable built into this JavaScript that we have access to on the web page that just refers to this entire web document, where I've used document.querySelector already to look through the whole web document, trying to find a button or trying to find an H1 tag, for example. But I can also add an event listener to the document itself. And in order to do that, I can say document.add event listener. And when I call add event listener, and I can do this on any HTML element, not just the document, but I could run this function on a button or on an H1 element or any other HTML element, add event listener will generally take 2 arguments, where the first is what event I want to listen for. The event could be something like click, when I click on the document. It could be something like when I scroll through a page, for example. But the event I'm going to listen for is a particularly special event called DOM content loaded. And the DOM content loaded event is an event that is going to be fired or triggered when the DOM, the document object model, the structure of the page, is done loading. When all of the elements on the page are done loading, the DOM content has been loaded, and then if I attach an event listener to it, it'll run whatever code I want to run. That should only run after the DOM is fully loaded, after all of the content on the page has then been loaded. And the second argument to add event listener is what function should run once the event actually happens, when the DOM content loaded does happen. So I could pass in the name of a function if I had the name of a function that I wanted to pass in. But alternatively, JavaScript allows me to just directly write a function here in the argument to add event listener. I can just say function, and then a set of parentheses to mean the function doesn't take any input. And then in curly braces, I can include the body of the function right here as the second argument to add event listener. And this is a little bit of tricky syntax to wrap your mind around if you've never seen it before. But the big picture way to think of it is add event listener takes two arguments. One is the event, the second is the function. So here first is the event, DOM content loaded, and the second argument is a function. And I declare the function same as before, just using function. I haven't given the function a name, because strictly speaking, it doesn't need a name. I'm never going to refer to this function by name. So it is what we might call an anonymous function, a function that has no name, but I'm still passing it into the add event listener function as an argument because I want to run the code inside of the function once the DOM is done loading. And so inside of curly braces then is the content of that function. The content of what code should run when the DOM is done loading. And then at the end, I again use just this end parenthesis, where that end parenthesis lines up with this is enclosing all of the arguments of the add event, where the first one is DOM content loaded, and the second one is this entire function that might span multiple lines. So you'll see syntax like this quite a bit. But now what I want to do is adding the event listener name. I can go ahead and just replace and put it here. And it turns out that if I wanted to, instead of saying .onClick equals count, you could have used the same syntax of add event listener. I could say add event listener, click, and then count to mean when the click event happens, go ahead and run the count function. But you can equivalently shorthand this and just say .onClick equals count. And that would work just as well. So now what we're saying here is that wait until the DOM is done loaded. Wait until all the content on the page is loaded, and then go ahead and run this function. And what the function is going to do is it's going to add the event handler to this button. And that'll work because now we'll be able to find the button, because now all of the content of the DOM has loaded. So now, if I go back, refresh counter.html, you'll notice that the JavaScript error goes away. I don't seem to have that error anymore. And now if I press count, we're able to see the count increment just as before. And so this then is an improvement upon what I've had before, where now I'm able to separate out my JavaScript code from all of the rest of my code. But much as in the case of CSS, where we were able to take CSS that was originally located in the head of our page and file, you can do the same thing with JavaScript too. And this can be helpful if people working on different files. You want one person working on the HTML and someone else working on JavaScript. It can be helpful if you expect that one of these things is going to change more frequently than the other, so you might not need to load the other one as often. So there can be value in separating our HTML code from our JavaScript even more by moving our JavaScript into a separate file. And so in order to do that, I can create a new file that I'll just call counter.js, contain all of the JavaScript for my counter.html file. So in order to do that, what I can say is let's go ahead and copy all of this JavaScript code, go ahead and cut it out of this page, and I'll paste it in, remove some of that indentation. So now I have a file called counter.js that just contains all of the JavaScript I want to run on my counter.html page. And now, rather than include actual JavaScript in between these script tags, what I can say is script src for source, equals counter.js. And go ahead and reference counter.js and use that JavaScript in the head of the page here. And that then is going to work exactly the same way. I still am able to count as high as I'd like. I still get an alert every time the count reaches a multiple of 10. But my HTML is now a little bit simpler. It's just the body, it's just the h1 and the button, and then all of my JavaScript is now located in a separate file that allows me to keep my HTML code and my JavaScript code separate from each other. And that can be valuable for a couple of reasons. Among them, if I have common JavaScript code that's in use by multiple different HTML pages, multiple HTML pages can all include the same JavaScript source rather than needing to repeat myself. To use the same JavaScript across multiple different pages, I can just use the same JavaScript across all of them. And that'll be helpful too as we begin to take a look later at some JavaScript libraries, which are JavaScript JavaScript written by other people, we can just include other people's JavaScript in our own web pages just by adding a script tag at the top of our page that specifies a particular source. You may have already interacted with Bootstrap that has its own JavaScript code, and you can include Bootstrap's JavaScript just by including a script tag at the top of our HTML page in order to say, go ahead and include all of that JavaScript in our page as well. So what else can we do now that we have the ability to get at elements of the DOM and actually manipulate their content? Well, one thing we can do is begin to make our pages a little bit more interactive, actually respond to what users are doing on the page, whether the user is typing something in or maybe filling out a form, for example. So let's go ahead and try an example of that, where the user might be filling out a form, and we would like for our code to somehow respond to what it is that they type. I'll go ahead and go back into hello.html. And now inside of the body of the page, I've said hello at the top. I'm here instead of a button. I'm going to have a form. This HTML form will look like the HTML forms we've seen before. I'll have an input field that I'll add the autofocus attribute to that automatically focus this input field when I open the page, because I might want the user to start typing right away. I'm going to give this input field an ID of name, for example, and then a placeholder of name, capital N, whose type is text. So what have I done here? I've created an input field where the user can type in some text. The placeholder, the thing the user sees filled into that input field originally, will just be capital N name, telling them they should type their name in here. And I've given this input field an ID, some unique identifier, such that I later on can reference and find this particular input field. And then I have input type equals submit, some way for me to now submit this form as well. And so if I load this page, load hello.html, here's what I see. Hello, a field where I can type in my name. The placeholder name shows up there for me. And then a button where I can submit this form. And now what I'd like to do inside of my JavaScript is, instead of this hello function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first run some JavaScript when the DOM is done loading. And so I'll use that same line from before. You're going to see it quite a bit, where we're going to say document.addEventListener, DOM content loaded, and then this function to mean go ahead and run this code when the DOM is done loaded. And the code I'd like to run is to say, when I submit the form, I want something to happen. When I submit the form, maybe I want to display an alert that if I typed in Brian, it'll say hello Brian. Or if I typed in David, it'll say hello David, for example. So how might I do that? Well, how do I get the form? That's the first question. Anytime you want to get at an element, one particular element on an HTML page, usually what we're going to do is document.querySelector to say, get me the element that is a form. And there's only one form on the page, so I don't have to worry about ambiguity. I'm just saying, get me that form. And then I can say .onSubmit, when you submit the form, what code should run. And if I had a name of a function, like a function f, I could just say run function f when the form is submitted. But alternatively, just as before, instead of providing the name of a function, I can also just provide the function itself. I can say function, and then in between these curly braces, I can specify exactly what code should run when the form is submitted by providing this anonymous function instead, using this anonymous function as the value of the onSubmit property of this form. And so now what I'd like to do is somehow get access to whatever the user typed into the input field, whatever the user's name happens to be. And so I could get the input field via document.querySelector input. And that would work this time. But we'll want to start to be a little bit careful, because on this page, there are multiple different input elements. There's an input element here for typing in the name, and a second input element here for giving me a button where I can submit this particular HTML form. And so what I probably want to do is be a little bit more specific. And it turns out that inside of QuerySelector, I can use all of the standard ways in CSS that we can select for a particular element. So in CSS, if you'll recall, we had the ability to run CSS and just say style all the H1s. Or we could say style all the things with this particular ID or with this particular class. And document.querySelector works the same way. That I can say document.querySelector and pass in a tag to say, get me the H1 element, or get me the button, or get me the form. But if there are multiple H1 elements or multiple buttons or multiple forms, I can be more specific than that if, for example, an element has an ID. In which case I can say document.querySelector and then in quotation marks, the hash mark, and then the name of the ID, to say, get me the element with that particular ID. Again, using the exact same syntax that CSS uses if I want to apply a particular set of styles to only one element that only has one ID. Likewise, too, I can say document.querySelector and then use dot followed by the name of a class if there's a particular class of elements and I want to just get one of those. Say, get me an element that has this particular class in order to manipulate it as well. So the same types of syntax that we could use in CSS for trying to reference and get at a particular HTML element, we can do the same thing here with document.querySelector to go ahead and try and get a particular element based on its tag name, based on its ID, or based on its class. And it was for that reason that inside of the HTML, my input, I gave the input an ID of name. I wanted some way to be able to uniquely reference it. And I can uniquely reference it not by input, but by pound name, where I can say, get me the element that has an ID of name. And that is the element that I would like to extract inside of my JavaScript code. Once I have that HTML element, what I want is what the user actually typed into that input field. And it turns out that if you have an input field in HTML, I can get access to what the user typed in by accessing its value property. Value is a property that refers to what it is the user actually typed in. So I can say .value. And I'm going to go ahead and save that inside of a variable. So I could say something like let name equal whatever the user typed in. But if I'm not going to reassign name to something else inside of this function, I'm really going to get the name once, and I'm not going to change it inside of the function. So I can use a const variable instead, and that would be better designed. To say I have a constant variable called name, which is equal to document.querySelector, get me the element whose ID is name, and get access to its value. And now I can display an alert. I can alert something like in backticks, hello, comma, and then using the $ curly brace syntax, I can say plug in the name there, followed by an exclamation mark. So I've extracted the name from the form. Get me the input field where they typed in the name, get access to its value, and then I'm displaying an alert that is going to say hello to that person, for example. And so now, if I refresh the page, I type in my name, I press submit, I get an alert that says hello Brian, I press OK, I can try it again. I can type in something like David, press submit, and now the page says hello David. So here again, we've been able to combine event listeners and functions and query selector to be able to both read information from the page in order to say, get me this particular HTML element, find me an HTML element, and access what the user typed into it, the .value property that gets me what the user typed into an input field. And we've been able to combine that with event listeners and alerts that are able to actually respond dynamically to when a user submits the form or when the entire content of the page is done loading in order to produce some interesting effects as well. But it turns out we can do more than just change the HTML that is contained within an element. We can also change CSS as well, change the style properties of a particular element as well. So let's go ahead and see an example of that. I'll go ahead and create a new file that I'll call colors.html. And inside of colors, I'll include the same standard HTML boilerplate code that we often start with, a head section with a title and a body section. And inside of the body of this page, I'm going to display a heading that just says hello, for example. And maybe I'll give it an ID, just so I can reference it by name. Maybe it has an ID.
things to say.
I just don't know what I'm supposed to be.
You'll figure that out. I'm not worried about you. Keep writing.
LaTeX. When you think of LaTeX, you might think of beautifully LaTeX. When you think of LaTeX, you might think of beautifully typeset mathematics, consistent LaTeX. When you think of LaTeX, you might think of beautifully typeset mathematics, consistent document structure, or professional-looking fonts. But you might also be reminded of cryptic compiler errors, over full bounding boxes, and disobedient quotation marks. LaTeX is unbeatable in terms of output quality, but there is room for improvement when it comes to user experience. Of course, there aren't that many good alternatives out there. WYSIWYG editors are even more painful to use for complicated documents, and they can't hope to match the quality of LaTeX. But does it have to be this way? If for some reason you really wanted to, could you use a standard word processor to approximate LaTeX while obtaining an arguably better editing experience? Introducing the WordTex template. The WordTex template includes a selection of styles that look similar to LaTeX. Creating a document is easy. Keyboard shortcuts enable the user to quickly switch styles, and headings and subheadings are automatically numbered. Math can be inserted with the Alt equals shortcut, and since Word supports many LaTeX keywords, creating complicated equations is actually pretty doable. Many standard LaTeX features are supported, including inline code, proofs, footnotes, enormous margins, and yes, if you try really hard, quotation marks that go the wrong way. Now you might be thinking, this must be ridiculously impractical to use for real documents. And yes, sometimes it is, but this hasn't deterred my research into this area. And there are some distinct advantages to using WordTech for typesetting documents, such as saved screen space, built-in illustration tools, and the ability to embed executable programs in your documents. And once you export it to a PDF, the results are almost indistinguishable. In fact, according to a randomized double-blind study, significant indifference has been shown between documents typeset in LaTeX and WordTech. Of course, there are some situations where LaTeX use just cannot be avoided. Some assignments or conferences require the LaTeX source for a submission, and sometimes you need to modify existing LaTeX documents. Fortunately, someone else has already designed a tool to deal with this problem. The open source software Pandoc can convert between a variety of formats, including Word and LaTeX. And using the WordTech plugin, you can quickly run conversions from within your document. Not all formatting is supported, but basic document structure is maintained, including headings, math, and code blocks. Undoubtedly, some people will be opposed to the idea of using a WYSIWYG editor for professional typesetting. They might say that tools like Word can hide formatting errors, and the only way to have complete control over your document is to edit its source directly. These people should be happy to learn that Word Word files are actually just zipped XML, so you can in fact edit WordTex documents using a text editor, should you so choose. WordTex successfully emulates many LaTeX features, but there is one area where it seems LaTeX should be pretty clearly superior: macros. LaTeX macros are very powerful. In addition to simple text replacement, they can include loops, counters, and conditionals, and are even Turing complete. Word is often more concise than LaTeX, making macros less necessary, but it would still be really nice to show that Word and LaTeX have the same computational power. Word does have a feature it calls macros, which are programmed in Visual Basic, but I don't think they count. You have to use a special file extension, and looking at the Stack Overflow developer survey, it doesn't seem like a great option. Probably the Word feature that is most similar to LaTeX macros is autocorrect, which performs basic text replacement when keywords are typed, but it's pretty limited. Well, it is possible to simulate a DFA by storing the states as strings and making autocorrect entries that replace a state and a character with the new state. And it's also possible to make a DFA with one stack, stored to the left of the state. And we can make it